hemorrhage is very, very high.
And you didn't see that in this autopsy?
It was not documented, and it's not visible on the autopsy photographs.
In your career as a forensic pathologist, have you looked at other strangulation type cases?
Yes, strangulation and other restraint situations where knees have been used, yes.
Do you typically see marks in those cases?
In manual strangulation, often you will see hemorrhaging into the muscles of the neck, and in cases where the knee has been used on the back, we often see a bruise consistent, and in times we have matched it to video cam footage of where we see a knee being placed, yes.
Including just finger marks, I suppose.
Yes, so just the pressure from somebody's fingers is enough to cause muscle hemorrhage in a manual strangulation case. We're not talking about a person putting weight on somebody, we're just talking about somebody squeezing a neck.
When you look at this case and you see the knee is involved, the shin bone is involved, would you expect to see a greater likelihood of bruising from just the fingers?
Objection, Your Honor, call for speculation.
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Sure. In this particular case, where the knee is involved, there's allegations of it being used to force or subdue Mr. Floyd, would you expect the knee and shin bone to have a greater likelihood to produce bruising?
Than fingers, yes.
And is there any objective medical findings in the autopsy showing pressure placed to the back?
No.
Now, again, we've talked about hypoxia, and we can take this down now, Judge. We've talked about hypoxia. What are the effects of hypoxia that you would expect to see if that were present?
So there are some observable symptoms when a person becomes hypoxic. Is that what you're asking, Councillor?
Yes.
Yes.
What are those?
So people typically start to get a little confused, disoriented. They may have visual changes. People describe little spots of light, a grey curtain coming down. So there are visual abnormalities that people will describe and complain of. They often become incoherent. They have difficulty in speaking. What is happening with hypoxia is your brain is getting progressively short of oxygen, and so you're getting decreased function of your brain. And some of those are going to mimic intoxication by other sources.
Did Mr. Floyd, based on your review, complain of such visual changes?
No. He complained of shortness of breath, but there was no indication that he made any statements that he was having difficulty in seeing things.
Is shortness of breath one of those things you'd expect to see in hypoxia?
Yes.
What causes that feeling of shortness of breath in a hypoxia situation?
So again, we're looking at hypoxia of the brain, which gives the person the sense that they need to breathe faster, breathe harder, they're short of breath. And that can be caused by inability to get oxygen in or air into the lungs. So an obstruction and or something that interferes with the airway or affects the ability to move the lungs. So it can be respiratory, or it can be cardiovascular. And you can get shortness of breath with heart attack, you can get shortness of breath with other vascular abnormalities. So therefore, it's not a good discriminator. It doesn't help you separate out whether or not there was a respiratory problem versus a distribution problem of the oxygen. Because what you're looking at is air coming into the lungs, and then the heart distributes it. And so if you have anything which interferes with the distribution of air from outside your body to the absorption through the heart and getting to the brain, all the brain perceives is I haven't got enough oxygen, and you get that sense of I am short of breath.
And does you get that same sensation from cardiac functions?
Yes, I just mentioned that, yes.
Okay, I'm sorry. In your review of the videos, did Mr. Floyd appear confused?
He, not to my eye, not confused to time and place, and disoriented, no.
Did you observe breathing patterns?
Yes.
How would you estimate his breathing to, what was the rate of his breathing?
I think my estimation was very similar to previous experts, about 20 to 25 breaths per minute.
And if someone is experiencing hypoxia, how would that affect the rate of breathing?
Typically, when you're short of breath, you breathe faster and faster and faster.
And is 22 to 25 breaths per minute considered rapid breathing?
It's faster than being at rest. And typically, I think at rest we would be breathing at less than 20. But it's certainly not a rapid respiratory rate, no.
How about certain types of phobias?
Yes. So, you know, if you have a phobia and you are pushed into a situation where you have to face the phobia, it's very stressful, and it will fire up your fight and flight type situation.
How would that affect the respiratory rate?
Well, the moment you go into fight and flight and your adrenaline is surging, you're likely to start, some people hyperventilate. There are lots of variables there.
So again, in terms of that respiration rate, you would expect it to increase well beyond the normal rate?
Yes, I would not expect it to slow down.
Okay. In terms of the placement of the knee and the neck, could you determine, based on your review, whether it appeared his airway was obstructed?
Yes, the placement of the knee is towards the back and the back right side of Mr. Floyd's neck, and the airway is around the front. It is nowhere close to his airway.
We were talking about having an open airway. How does that affect your ability to speak?
The ability to speak or make any other sound, groaning, and Mr. Floyd did groan. So any of the sounds that Mr. Floyd is making requires you to be able to take air in over the vocal cords and out over the vocal cords. And so therefore, you cannot make sound unless you're moving air and that your mouth is open and people can actually hear to some extent. I can hum with my mouth closed, but it's not effective. So the bottom line is moving air in and out and speaking and making noise is very good evidence that the airway was not closed.
Now, in terms of, again, prior testimony, did you review or watch the testimony of Dr. Tobin?
I did not watch all of Dr. Tobin's testimony, no.
Okay. Did you hear him discussing the hypopharynx?
I did.
And hypopharynx compression?
Yes.
Have you ever seen anything in the forensic medical literature that a compression of the hypopharynx can cause asphyxia?
I have not.
When you heard his testimony, what steps and efforts did you take to consider that?
Started to do a survey of the available medical literature to ensure that I hadn't missed something. And I could not find...
Objection, Your Honor. Sidebar.
Overruled. Continue.
I could not find anything in the forensic literature talking about pressure applied to the neck causing a hypopharynx.
Objection, Your Honor. Failure to dispose.
Overruled.
And then I went to the standard medical literature, and there are entities which cause impairment of the hypopharynx, but they are usually, well, they all were focused on foreign bodies being inhaled, such as hot dogs or some other object, and then also tumors in that area potentially blocking off that structure. So nothing that really matched the testimony of Dr. Chauvin, as I understand it.
Okay. In terms of hypoxia, moving back to that hypoxia, is hypoxia, the signs of hypoxia, is that a progressive or a fast process?
Typically, it can be both, but you have to recognize that there is oxygen in your blood that is there, and it takes a while to use up that particular oxygen. So in most circumstances, the onset of hypoxia is gradual. If I restrict somebody's breathing and slow it down by some means or stop it by some means, there is still oxygen dissolved in their blood. You can hold your breath for 30 seconds with comfort. At 45 seconds, you're probably getting a little uncomfortable and you want to breathe. That's your innate reflex trying to override your voluntary suppression of your breathing. But you could probably go out to a minute before you start feeling woozy and or uncomfortable and disoriented. And so that is that's the heart continuing to distribute what you've got in your. And so we see hypoxia occurring gradually in most circumstances over time. It's not something which is an on-off switch and rapid.
And as far as those symptoms that you see or would expect to see in a hypoxic situation, do they gradually progress like that as well?
Typically, yes.
Did you notice hypoxic changes in this particular case?
No. Mr. Floyd was coherent and understandable until shortly before there was a sudden cessation of his movement.
So if Mr. Floyd in this case was progressively suffering from hypoxia, what would you have expected to observe?
I would expect him to become disoriented, confused, incoherent. I would expect some of those symptoms to be at least somewhat apparent.
And you would have, in your review of the videos, would you have expected to see a progression in that hypoxia?
Objection, Your Honor, ask and answer that given to.
Sorry, understood. Now, how about asphyxia due to position or compression? Let's talk about that. What is that effect?
So there are certain positions a person can get into which impairs your breathing.
And what does that lead to?
It leads to difficulty in moving your diaphragm and your chest, and impairing your ability to reoxygenate your blood.
Can that lead to hypoxia?
Yes.
Which bodily organ would you expect to see affected first?
The brain.
And all of those effects on speech and orientation and things progressing?
Correct.
But you described what you saw as a sudden change. What does that mean to your analysis?
So Mr. Floyd goes from making clear statements, and some of the words I heard were please, and I'm short of breath, please, and then there's a period of about 45 seconds of silence, but he's still moving and seems to be active, and then there's a sudden relaxation. And so he goes from pretty much fully functional and coherent to unconscious very rapidly.
So in this particular case, how does his 90% blockage of the right coronary artery come into play?
So what you're looking at there is a sudden decompensation which is much more consistent with a sudden cardiac event. And what happens there is, the moment the heart stops pumping sufficient blood, there is no circulation of blood. There is no circulation of the blood that still has some oxygen in it. And the brain will function for about 15 seconds, 10 to 15 seconds with full consciousness. After that, the person loses consciousness, but is not instantly dead. People don't suddenly stop breathing when they go unconscious. They will continue to breathe for a period of time, which can be as long as a minute or two, until the respiratory center in your brain shuts down. And at that stage, the person stops breathing.
So in this case, can you just kind of describe the layers of factors that lead you to your conclusion that this was a sudden cardiac event?
Yes. So we have a heart that's vulnerable because it's too big. It demands lots of oxygen. It has very narrow vessels. There are certain drugs that are present in his system that make it, put it at risk of an arrhythmia, the methamphetamine. There is another drug, fentanyl, which slows down your breathing, which will lower the oxygen, potentially saturation in your blood. We've got the carbon monoxide, which has the potential to rob some of that additional oxygen carrying capacity. And then we've got vasoconstriction. So there are multiple entities all acting together and adding to each other and taking away from a different part of the ability to get oxygen into his heart. And so at some point, the heart exhausted its reserves of metabolic supply and went into an arrhythmia and then stopped pumping blood effectively.
Now, just a couple more topics to just cover with you, Doctor. You did review in any death investigation, do you review the role that controlled substances play in death?
Yes.
Do you do that on a regular basis?
It's a very important part of a forensic investigation, and most medical examiners' offices will try to get close to 100% toxicology analysis on their cases if suitable specimens are available.
Now, in terms of the toxicology in this case, how would you characterize the role of fentanyl from the standpoint of forensic pathology? Not toxicology, forensic pathology.
So fentanyl is a powerful narcotic. It's about 80 times more powerful than morphine. And the side effects of fentanyl are slowing down the respiration. So that impairs your ability to breathe as fast as you normally would.
Does that result in decreased oxygen saturation?
It would result in decreased air exchange, which would mean decreasing the oxygen in the bloodstream, but also not fully getting rid of the carbon dioxide, the byproducts of our normal metabolism, so slowly increasing carbon dioxide in his bloodstream.
Now, again, within the context of forensic pathology, what does the presence of norfentanyl mean to you?
Norfentanyl is a byproduct of fentanyl. It's a metabolic byproduct. And so in your liver, or in Mr. Floyd's liver, as the fentanyl passed through the liver, it was broken down into norfentanyl, which is the metabolic byproduct. It's the liver beginning to destroy and metabolize the fentanyl and remove it from the body system.
Now, I'm going to, for the court, I have, there are 3 slides contained within your PowerPoint presentation. I've independently marked them as exhibits 1059, 1060, and 1061. I'd like to show them to the witness. Can you see that, Doctor?
Yes.
Would you agree that this appears to be a screenshot taken from the body-worn camera of Officer Lane at 20:09 and 44 seconds.
Correct.
Looking at the second one, would you agree that this again appears to be a body-worn camera image taken at 20:09 45 seconds?
Yes.
And finally, a third image at 20:09 and 48 seconds.
Yes.
All right. In 2061.
No objection, Your Honor.
And received.
Your Honor, permission to publish 1059. So in this image, Doctor, it's kind of hard to see. What, in your review, did you determine whether there was the possibility that controlled substances were ingested at the time of approach by Officers King and Lane?
Yes.
And what do you see in this image, 1059, that is consistent with that?
In the back corner of Mr. Floyd's mouth, you can see what appears to be a white object.
See if I can- Are you talking this object right there? Oops.
Just slightly higher up than that, yes.
Can't. Well, why don't you do it?
Sorry, I covered it with the dot, but that's what I'm referring to.
All right.
You see it just underneath the dot.
Now, in the next image, 1060, what appears to be happening?
In this particular image, it appears that Mr. Floyd is looking away from, excuse me, from Officer Lane.
And looking at the timestamps, that's approximately 1 second later.
Yes.
And in the third image, does he appear to be looking at Officer Lane again?
Yes.
And do you see that same object in his mouth?
I can, yes.
You can. And so, what does this lead you to conclude, or what do you strike at? Oops. We could do this. In terms of the later analysis, there you understand there was some evidence collected from the backseat of Squad 320.
That is my understanding, yes.
And do you know what that substance was?
There was some material there that had saliva and DNA on it that matched Mr. Floyd, and those, I believe, and those objects had fentanyl and methamphetamine, if my memory serves me correctly.
So is that what you conclude your analysis on in terms of the ingestion of controlled substances as far as the timing in this case? Both before they were approached as well as during, in the backseat of the squad car?
Yes.
Now, how does the depression of the respiratory rate, we may have covered this, I apologize, how does the depression of the respiratory system, how does that affect the heart specifically?
If the respiratory rate is decreased, the amount of oxygen that is getting into the bloodstream through the lungs is decreased. If I breathe slowly, I'm not able to get as much oxygen into my lungs as if I'm breathing very rapidly. So anything which slows down respiration is going to affect the ability to oxygenate your blood.
And will that also work in concert with the coronary artery issues?
It makes it worse. Again, anything which lowers his oxygen saturation in the blood will act again to restrict oxygen supply to his heart muscles past that blockage.
How about you also understand that methamphetamine was found in the toxicology?
Yes.
And how would you look at the role of methamphetamines from the perspective of a forensic pathologist?
So methamphetamine has three major factors. It can cause arrhythmias, it causes vasoconstriction, and it causes the heart to beat faster. Those are its three major physiological or pharmacological activities. And that would impair, again, an individual in Mr. Floyd's condition with his heart disease and put him at risk.
Now, in terms of, again, the toxicology findings, in the fentanyl, there was the metabolite norfentanyl, correct?
Yes.
What does that tell you in terms of the timing of when Mr. Floyd may have ingested the fentanyl?
It tells you at least some of the fentanyl was taken at some point previously, at some time before, that allowed for enough time for the fentanyl to be absorbed and then pass through the liver and some of it to be broken down. That doesn't happen instantaneously. It can take a period of time.
And methamphetamine, does it have a similar metabolite?
It has a metabolite, yes.
And what is the metabolite?
Amphetamine.
And based on your review of the toxicology in the case, was there amphetamine found?
I did not see any amphetamine in the reports.
What does that suggest to you as a forensic pathologist relevant to the time at which Mr. Floyd would have ingested the methamphetamine?
So that would be consistent with a recent ingestion of methamphetamine.
And in terms of the phase of absorption or elimination, where would that place him?
Well, if there's no evidence of elimination, i.e. metabolism from methamphetamine to amphetamine, it's not in the elimination phase. And given that there appears to be, there's none of that, he's still probably in the absorptive phase. It's consistent with the absorptive phase.
And ultimately, those pills that were found in the back seat of the squad car, you understand that when Mr. Floyd was in the squad car, he was handcuffed.
Objection, rephrase.
Sustained.
What information did you have about Mr. Floyd's ability to ingest those controlled substances while he was in the squad car?
He had his hands cuffed behind his back from the videos, and those were placed outside when he was taken out of his own vehicle. I did not see any time when those were removed until such time as resuscitation was attempted. So the entire time he had his hands cuffed behind his back. And therefore I cannot think of a plausible way that an individual would be able to get materials into their mouth while restrained in such a format.
Now, the last topic I'd like to discuss with you is the paraganglioma. Did I say that right?
That is close.
All right. Can you just describe what that is?
A paraganglioma. So this is a tumor that was found at the time of autopsy down in Mr. Floyd's lower abdominal area. And these are tumors. And they typically are of two types. One which is has parasympathetic, or is similar to the parasympathetic part of your nervous system, which does not secrete any substances, or certainly vasoactive substances like catecholamine. And then there are the sympathetic ones, which have the ability to secrete. The parasympathetic ones tend to be found up in the head and neck area, and the sympathetic ones tend to be found down in the lower abdominal area. Again, this is where Mr. Floyd's was found.
What's the relevance of finding the paraganglioma in this case?
So these tumors have, at least the ones in the pelvic area, if they are secreting vasoactive substances, catecholamines is the correct term, they will cause an individual potentially to be hypertensive. So that's one of their baseline, if they have a low level of secretion. And the other thing that paragangliomas do is every now and then Without warning, they'll have a sudden surge in secretion, so they're cyclical, which sometimes makes it difficult to diagnose them. You have to do specific testing to diagnose them to get around the cyclical activity.
So, just kind of in conclusion, Doctor, did you form ultimately opinions as to the cause and manner of death of Mr. Floyd?
Yes.
And what would those conclusions be?
Mr. Floyd died of a cardiac arrhythmia due to hypertensive atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease during the restraint.
And were there contributing causes?
Yes.
What are those?
The substances, the fentanyl and the methamphetamine, the potential of a carbon monoxide role, and the potential that the paraganglioma was adding adrenaline to this whole mixture, making things even worse.
How would you classify the manner of death?
So this is one of those cases where you have so many conflicting different manners. The carbon monoxide would usually be classified as an accident, although somebody was holding him there. So some people would say you could elevate that to a homicide. You've got the drugs on board. In most circumstances, in most jurisdictions, a drug intoxication would be considered to be an accident. He's got significant natural disease, certainly the heart. Paraganglioma, you can certainly consider it as a potential exacerbating process, but I wouldn't put it at the top of the list there. So he's got a mixture of that. And then he's in a situation where he's been restrained in a very stressful situation, and that increased his fight and flight type reaction, and that would, during restraint, would be considered a homicide. And you put all of those together, it's very difficult to say which of those is the most accurate. So I would fall back to undetermined.
Now, if we
in this particular case.
If we put your slide regarding the undetermined manner again back up. So essentially this, Doctor, you would agree that this had lots of or many potential contributing causes?
Correct.
And under the definition, the name's definition of an undetermined manner, how does that apply?
So that is what this classification under the name guidelines is really one of the uses of this particular classification is when you've got so many conflicting different potential mechanisms of death that could lead to so therefore the manner is not clear.
Your Honor, I have no further questions.
Members of the jury, will take our lunch recess. We'll reconvene at 1:30. Council remain for a short time. And Doctor, you may step down.
Thank you very much.
You bet. Thank you. All right, be seated. We did have a sidebar regarding one objection by the state regarding certain testimony of this witness, including lack of disclosure. and we had not talked about this earlier. And so I wanted the state to know that in order to meet anything, we have experts who are watching each other's testimony. And this expert testified that he did certain things very close to his testimony. I am allowing the state until tomorrow. I'm not going to make you come up with any rebuttal today. Even if we finish today with the defense case, I would allow the state to consider and call anybody in rebuttal, meet anything, because I assume that Dr. Tobin or others might be listening. And so I would give, and that's why I overruled the objection, is because even if it had been disclosed, I would have allowed it and given the state time to respond, and I will give you overnight so there's not any prejudice to the state if it was not disclosed. That's my reasoning, Your Honor. Or for if you're saying, Your Honor, I really didn't get a chance to look at this report, what are you thinking? That's why. I didn't want you to think it was personal. So, Mr. Blackwell and Mr. Nelson, feel free to talk overnight in case there is a way, if there is rebuttal testimony, if we can somehow make that come in easily.
Yes, Your Honor.
Well, we won't get into that. That's your business, not mine. But I will allow you overnight to prepare any rebuttal.
Thank you, Judge.
Okay, thank you. See you at 1:30. Dr. Schiller under oath.
Thank you very much, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Blackwell, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Your Honor, counsel, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Fowler, good afternoon.
Good afternoon, sir.
I'd like to say I have a few questions for you, but I have more than a few this afternoon. Let me just start with some basic questions, just by way of sort of background of yourself as an expert witness. Do you agree that as an expert witness, you should be objective, fair, and impartial as best you can?
Yes, I would agree that that's appropriate as best you can.
Do you agree that in the background research you do to testify, that you should be thorough?
Yes.
Meaning you should do your homework before you arrive at your opinions. Fair enough?
Yes.
I asked that question in part because you asked a question about Mr. Chauvin's weight, and you understand that the relevance of Mr. Chauvin's weight to this case is how much weight he was putting onto the body of George Floyd beneath him. You understand that, don't you?
Yes.
You told the jury that Mr. Chauvin's weight was 140 pounds, didn't you?
That's the information that I was provided, yes.
Where did you get this information provided?
From counsel.
In the information that was provided to you, were you not told that Mr. Chauvin was wearing equipment?
That was not considered as part of the process. I would agree with you, Counselor.
Right, so you know he is wearing equipment, though. He's a police officer at the time, right?
Absolutely.
And so you didn't factor in the weight of his equipment that was also on the body of Mr. Floyd. Is that true?
That is true.
Now, you agree that as an expert witness, you shouldn't jump to conclusions. That is, you should reach fair conclusions based upon a careful, considered analysis.
That is correct, yes.
Do you agree that you shouldn't come at this in a way that's biased? You agree with that, don't you?
Absolutely agree with that, yes.
You shouldn't cherry pick facts.
No.
You shouldn't try to confuse the jury.
Correct.
Now, there's a reason I ask about that too, because you spent quite a bit of time talking about carbon monoxide. You remember that discussion, don't you?
I do indeed.
Now, just going right to the punchline on carbon monoxide that you talked about at some length, you haven't seen any data or test results that showed Mr. Floyd had a single injury from carbon monoxide. Is that true?
That is correct, because it was never sent to
I
the
just simply
laboratory for
asked you
that
whether
test.
I asked you whether it was true, sir. Yes or no?
It is true.
Now, as you were talking about carbon monoxide, you were referring to the squad car that Mr. Floyd was near, weren't you?
Yes.
Have you ever laid eyes, I don't mean pictures, physically, on the squad car that you were referring to?
I have not.
Do you know whether it has a single exhaust or a double exhaust?
The information that I was provided, it has a double exhaust with twin exhaust pipes on each side, so it has 4 exhausts.
Right. Now, did you know the make and the model of the car?
It is a Ford Explorer Interceptor.
Is it a hybrid?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Now, did you see any air monitoring data that actually would give you any information as to what amount of carbon monoxide, if any, would have been in Mr. Floyd's breathing zone?
No, because it was not tested.
It was a yes or no question. You haven't seen any, have you?
I have not seen any data.
And you didn't go yourself to try to do anything akin to air monitoring, air sampling to simulate what Mr. Floyd might have been exposed to in proximity of a similar vehicle. You didn't do that, did you?
Mr. Blackwell.
Thank you, Your Honor. Do you agree with me that there was no finding of carbon monoxide poisoning from Dr. Baker's autopsy review?
I do.
You mentioned an EPA standard of 9 parts per million on an 8-hour basis as the exposure limit for carbon monoxide. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
And you mentioned 35 parts per million, what I call a peak exposure. That is an exposure for a 1-hour time period.
That is correct, yes.
Now, you are not now, nor have you ever been an industrial hygienist, true?
Absolutely correct. I have not been.
Now, the fact that the EPA provides a standard of 9 parts per million on an 8-hour basis, that's a time-weighted average, isn't it?
Yes, that is your maximum exposure over that period, and you're allowed to do that once in 1 year.
So it's a time-weighted average over 8 hours. Are you able to tell this jury whether or not Mr. Floyd, at the time that he was being subdued on May 25th, was being exposed to carbon monoxide above the limit or level that was set by the EPA of 9 parts per million?
No, no testing was done.
For that matter, cutting even more to the chase, how do you know the car was even on?
It was a question I specifically asked, and then I made an observation of water dripping from what appears to be a tailpipe.
So if I ask you directly, do you know if in fact the car was on or not? You didn't see any information or data from anybody who says I either turned the car on or I'm the one who turned it off. You didn't see either one, did you?
Correct.
And you just simply assumed by seeing something dripping from a tailpipe that the car had to have been on.
It's not an assumption, it's an evaluation, which in my mind indicates that the vehicle was running.
You mentioned carbon monoxide studies. These are outside studies that you're referring to. Remember those outdoor studies?
They are referring to outdoor air, yes.
You referenced a total of 2 studies, true?
The carbon monoxide, which studies are you referring to?
I'm referring to the San Antonio study. I'm sorry, 3. Well, San Antonio study, the DeMaio, and then the Polish study?
So the DeMaio and San Antonio are one in the same.
Okay.
Dr. DeMaio was the chief medical examiner at the San Antonio chief medical examiner's office when he wrote that article.
So then if we have the San Antonio study and then DeMaio are one study, that one study involved 3 people, didn't it?
Correct.
And then we have the study you told us about, the Polish study, that involved 1 person, right?
Correct.
Can you tell the ladies and gentlemen of the jury how long were the subjects in those studies exposed to carbon monoxide? Do you know?
It's unknown.
Now, I had another issue that I wanted to raise, again, under this heading of the jury not being confused. And this relates to the white substance that you were referring to in the mouth of Mr. Floyd. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
And so it started with the white substance in his mouth, and I think it ended with talking about a partially digested pill in a car. Remember that?
Yes, I do.
I'd like to show you and discuss with you a couple of exhibits. Now, you told us that you looked at surveillance video from stores in discussing the materials that you reviewed. Remember that?
Yes, sir.
And the store at issue here is Cup Foods.
That was one of them, yes.
So you recall looking at the surveillance video from Cup Foods.
Yes.
I want to review part of that video with you, if I could. And if we pull up Exhibit 29, I think it's in evidence. One moment, John. So I'm showing you an excerpt from Exhibit 29 and inside Cup Foods. And I want us together to observe George Floyd. Yeah, 7:41 and then 42. You can go ahead and play it, Brad. And could you zoom in on Mr. Altiste on George Floyd and were you able to see that portion of the clip, Dr. Fowler?
Yes,
Were you able to see that George Floyd was chewing?
Overruled if you have an opinion.
I saw his mouth open and close briefly. He could have been chewing. I don't know.
Let's play it again, because I would like for you to know. It was fast, Your Honor. If I could.
Do you need to see it again to render your opinion?
From what I saw, Your Honor, it was too brief to.
See if that changes your opinion.
All right, now I want to show you a couple of stills. If Your Honor, I've made a couple of stills from this segment of the footage that I marked separately as exhibits 812 and 813, and I would move their admission.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
812 and 813 are received.
So if you put up 812, Brad? And could you zoom in again on George Floyd? Now, Dr. Fowler, can you see a white substance in George Floyd's mouth there?
I can.
And doesn't it look remarkably similar to the white substance that you were talking about when you were discussing the photograph with the gun pointed at him in the car when he was first approached by the police?
Yes, it looks very similar.
Is it your understanding that when Mr. Floyd left Cup Foods, he went out across the street to sit in the vehicle?
Yes.
And next he was then approached by the police sitting in the vehicle, right?
I believe he was first approached by the clerks from the store, and then he was approached by the police subsequently.
So would it be fair to say, in order to say that the white substance in Mr. Floyd's mouth was a pill, in light of what you've seen, that would be jumping to a conclusion, wouldn't it?
Specifically, when I testified, I said there was a white object in his mouth. That's all I could discern from that, and I remember saying that under direct.
So you are not then either telling or suggesting to the jury that the white substance was a pill, are you?
I never said it was a pill. I carefully said that I could see a white structure in his mouth.
Dr. Fowler, if you just answer
And I did not want to classify it, and I didn't
if you
classify
just answer my question.
Yes.
You're not either telling or suggesting to the jury that the white substance was a pill, are you?
No, I never did.
One other thing, under the heading of not wanting to confuse the jury. You had a discussion with Mr. Nelson about a scientist, Dr. Ray, R-E-A-Y, and the statement you made, and you can correct me so I say it accurately, but it was to the effect that he had been critical of prone positioning and his relationship to asphyxia, but that he had later retracted that opinion. Remember discussing that?
Yes.
Now, the statement that Dr. Ray had retracted his concerns about the dangers and hazards of the prone position with respect to asphyxia, that statement was in fact never withdrawn by Dr. Ray. Isn't that the real truth?
He withdrew it and said that it was more of a risk to individuals who were obese, is my recollection of the course of events in Dr. Ray's history.
Your Honor, I want to show Exhibit 818 simply for identification purposes to discuss with the witness. So let me show you first. This is an affidavit from Dr. Ray. And if you look on the second page, if you have that, Mr. Eltis, do you see where he has signed it here and dated it? Donald Ray.
Yes.
That's the person you're referring to, right?
Yes, Dr. Donald Ray.
Let's go back to the first page and see if he retracted this. So let's see the first paragraph, just so we see what this is about. Statement written by Donald Ray and sent to Charlie Miller in June of 1998. In the November issue of the Annals of Emergency Medicine, Chan et al. Published a paper entitled Restraint Position and Positional Asphyxia. This is one of the studies that you were referencing earlier today, isn't it?
Yes.
If we go down, Brett, 2 paragraphs to the I readily acknowledge. Here, Dr. Ray is saying, I readily acknowledge the value of these studies, that is Chan studies, in the San Diego case of Price versus San Diego, which had many other features besides hog tying in the restraint maneuvers used to control the victims. This has since been presented in law enforcement publications as my retraction of positional asphyxia as a cause of death, with particular reference to hog tying. And let's look at the next paragraph. Here's the punchline, Dr. Fowler. Such is not the case. I still maintain that there are risks and hazards. I'm reading what it says, Ron.
Well, the question, what's the question?
The question is simply exploring what it is that Dr. Ray, in fact, said on the issue of whether he retracted this statement.
30 minutes to make sure there's a question after each portion as to whether it's true or not.
All right.
Mr. Blackwell, would you join us on the sidebar?
Yes, Your Honor.
So if you could re-ask the question, just so we're clear.
Yeah, sorry, Your Honor. So, Dr. Fowler, I'd like to explore with you Dr. Ray's response on the question of whether he retracted his statements of concerns about positional asphyxia as relates to the prone position. Did Dr. Ray say, as you see here, that such is not the case?
Yes, I do.
And do you see where he says, I still maintain that there are risks and hazards to restraint maneuvers, including hog tying, and each case must be evaluated to assess the presence or absence of respiratory restriction in light of the method of restraint? Do you see that?
Yes, that's what's written in this affidavit.
And then one more point here he makes. If we can see just 2 paragraphs down, the point. He says here, do you see this? The point is that street deaths are much different than controlled investigations. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so, Dr. Fowler, does having seen this affidavit from Dr. Ray change your opinion as to whether he had retracted his opinion of concerns about the prone position as relates to positional asphyxia?
So it appears that he hasn't completely withdrawn his position, but
Thank
he does
you.
go into some additional description, which is the paragraph above, which you didn't
Dr.
highlight.
Fowler, you answered my question. And if there are other things that Mr. Nelson would like to bring out, he'll have an opportunity to. Thank you, Brian. Now let's talk for just a moment about your areas of expertise. We know that you are a forensic pathologist, sir, but you're not a toxicologist, or you don't have a degree in toxicology.
That is correct. I'm not a toxicologist.
And to be clear for the jury, as a forensic pathologist, you don't treat patients.
Correct.
We have heard from a pulmonologist who's also a respiratory physiologist. You're not a pulmonologist or a respiratory physiologist. True?
That is true.
So you never measured anybody's respiration, that is their breathing, as a part of your work as a forensic pathologist?
No, I have not.
You're not a cardiologist, obviously.
No.
Just by way of just a couple of background things, you told us a good bit about your background, but what year was it that you arrived in the United States?
I believe it was 1991.
And in what year did you retire?
December 31st, 2019.
You told us quite a good bit about the forensic panel, and you're employed as a consultant by the forensic panel. Is that a fair description?
Yes.
Now, to be clear for the jurors so they're not confused, the forensic panel is not a non-profit, is it?
No, it's not a non-profit. At least to the best of my ability, I don't know what they're classified as, frankly. I do not know.
So, through the forensic panel, you earn a livelihood, so it's not volunteer time for you, is it?
No, I get compensated by the hour.
And the forensic panel, then, is not a governmental body.
Correct, it's an independent organization.
It's a business.
It's a medical/forensic science practice, which medical practices are businesses, yes.
It's a business.
Yeah.
So I want to talk with you a bit about asphyxial deaths. It's been what we've been referring to as deaths caused by low oxygen. Do you agree, Dr. Fowler, that positional asphyxia is placing a person into a position that restricts their ability to ventilate their lungs, or a position where the head may be in such a position that you can't keep the airways open?
That is correct, yes.
And then at the end of the day, in positional asphyxia, what gets restricted is a person's ability to oxygenate their blood because of the position they're in, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Doctor, there are two component methods of ventilating the lungs. One is to move your ribs, and the other is to be able to move your diaphragm. Is that true?
That is true, yes.
But the key thing for breathing is that you'll be able to expand your chest. If you can't expand your chest, you can't breathe.
Correct. You need to expand the capacity of the chest cavity so that the lungs draw air in as part of the process.
You know, I'd like to focus with you for a moment on the first roughly 5 minutes that Mr. Floyd was on the ground as part of the subdual and the restraint under Mr. Chauvin. Did you analyze where Mr. Chauvin's knees were relative to the positioning of Mr. Floyd's body in that first 5 minutes?
I did review the positioning, yes.
Would you agree with me that for over half of that time period, Mr. Chauvin's left knee was on the neck, and his right knee is at times on the back, and at other times on his left arm, or pushed in against his left side?
That is correct. Those are all the positions that I observed the knee in, the right knee, during that period of time.
And so Mr. Floyd then is sandwiched in a way between Mr. Chauvin on top and the asphalt pavement beneath it, right?
Yes, if you...
It's a yes or no question.
Yes.
I want to ask you a question about putting pressure on someone's neck. That is, if you're on a person's back and you are applying pressure to the neck. Doctor, do you agree that if pressure is applied to somebody's neck in the prone position and the person is squeezed until they become responsive, and if that pressure is maintained for a minimum of 4 minutes, that can cause irreversible brain damage because the brain may be starved of oxygen? Is that true?
Once cessation of oxygen to the brain starts...
Dr. Fowler, my question was, is it true?
Would you please restate the question?
Yes, sir. If you apply pressure to someone's neck and squeeze until the person becomes unresponsive, and you maintain that pressure for at least 4 minutes, you will cause irreversible brain damage because you will have starved the brain of oxygen. Is that true?
Correct. It takes 4 minutes of no supply of oxygen to the brain to cause irreversible brain damage.
Now, if somebody dies as a result of the consequences of insufficient oxygen or low oxygen, we know that when that person dies, they're going to die of cardiopulmonary arrest, because everybody dies of cardiopulmonary arrest. Fair enough?
Yes.
And if a person dies as a result of low oxygen, that person's also going to die ultimately of a fatal arrhythmia, right?
Correct. Every one of us in this room will have a fatal arrhythmia at some point.
Right, because that's kind of how you go.
Yes.
So I want to talk about the role of sort of physical activity, struggle, if you will, on the oxygen stores or reserves when somebody may be in the prone position. Do you agree that when somebody is involved in a pretty vigorous physical confrontation, they would certainly have what's referred to as an oxygen deficit?
Yes. Any kind of exertion, you build up a degree of lactic acid and other metabolites that need to be removed from the body. And the term oxygen debt is used more in the lay environment, but yes, you have some makeup to do.
And because you're using up your oxygen reserves then?
Somewhat, but it's also more generation of the metabolic byproducts from the actual activity as well.
Well, would you agree that somebody with an oxygen deficit who is involved in a vigorous physical confrontation would be more susceptible to positional asphyxia than would otherwise be the case? Do you agree with that?
Yes. It would be more difficult for them to regain their, to get rid of the metabolic byproducts of the activities that occurred before.
And would you agree then that a person with an oxygen deficit or debt is more prone to any kind of asphyxia than a person completely at rest? Do you agree with that?
Yes, a fully oxygenated person at rest would certainly be at no risk of, or not no, but a substantially lower level of risk of an arrhythmia compared to somebody who has been exercised hard.
Dr. Fowler, are you familiar with a text known as Spitz and Fisher?
Yes.
Pretty big. This is a standard text for medical examiners, isn't it?
It's certainly one of the recommended books that fellows in forensic pathology will review as part of their training, yes.
And it's one you've in the past referred to as a reliable text.
Yes.
It is handed out to all forensic pathologists in training as just a standard text.
Again, it's recommended that they use that as one of their references.
And you aware that this text on medical legal investigation of death, it contains sections on deaths by asphyxia, doesn't it?
Yes.
And do you agree that for death by positional asphyxia, that is death caused by low or insufficient oxygen, that the causes for that may be what's referred to as endless?
Yes. Hence the complexity of these particular cases.
So you spoke with Mr. Nelson about the fact that on autopsy, when somebody dies of asphyxia or insufficient oxygen, you might see injuries to the ribs or to the vertebrae that indicate the type of restraint, or at least how the asphyxia came about. You might see that, right?
Yes.
You might see what we refer to as traumatic manifestations, things like bruises, evidence of injuries on autopsy. You might see those, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Do you agree, Dr. Fowler, that the majority of cases where somebody dies of asphyxia are very subtle and in fact, no traumatic manifestations are visible at all.
That is correct, depending on the circumstances.
And what I mean by that is that there isn't necessarily any evidence, any physical evidence on autopsy of what it is that caused the low oxygen in the majority of cases, right?
In a substantial number of the cases, I'm not sure it's absolutely the majority.
Brett, could you skip to page 828? Dr. Fowler, can you see here from this is from Spitz and Fisher. For identification purposes, Your Honor, it's Exhibit 814 for the record. Am I reading here correctly that, however, the majority of cases are subtle, in fact, often with no traumatic manifestations at all? I read that accurately?
Yes, you did.
Thank you, Brett. Are you familiar with a publication called Knight's Forensic Pathology?
By Sir Bernard Knight, yes.
And that's another reliable authority for forensic pathologists, isn't it?
Correct.
Did you know that that Knight's Forensic Pathology also has a chapter on suffocation and asphyxia?
Yes.
That doesn't surprise you, does it?
Doesn't surprise me, and I've seen it.
And that is Exhibit 815, just for identification purposes. And I want to show you what's said at page 354. This is taken from Knight's. Knight's, it says, there are no truly distinctive autopsy signs of pure hypoxia, and most of the alleged criteria are caused by factors other than a lack of oxygen. Did I read that accurately? Dr. Fowler?
Yeah, I'm just reading it and trying to process it. I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry. No, please. Take your time.
Yes, that's what it says.
Now, you had some discussions with Mr. Nelson about strangulation. You do understand in this case that no one is contending that Mr. Floyd was manually strangled by anyone. You understand that, don't you?
Oh, absolutely correct. There was no evidence of manual strangulation and no discussion of manual strangulation.
Dr. Fowler, do you agree that with respect to positional asphyxia, the diagnosis of positional asphyxia is one that is made by investigation, because you won't find an autopsy finding that necessarily, specifically tells you why the person is asphyxiated?
Correct. The scene information becomes very important.
Now, you spent quite a bit of time talking about the prone position studies, and I referenced them just a few minutes ago by Chan and others. Let me ask you a couple of other questions just about those studies and to try to correlate them to this case. Is it true, Dr. Fowler, that none of the prone restraint studies that you referred to actually studied subjects who had someone's knee on their neck in the prone position? Is that true?
That is true.
None of the studies went for as long as 9 minutes and 29 seconds. Is that true?
That is true.
So do you agree, Dr. Fowler, that if the weight of several officers or a police officer is put on the actual torso and abdominal areas of a person in police custody, that can cause compressional or positional asphyxia. Do you agree with that?
If it exceeds the limits of 225 pounds, as found by multiple studies, then yes, your argument is correct.
Could I show Brett Exhibit 808 for identification purposes? Sorry, Judge. Let me ask you first. You did give a deposition in a case that is called Curtis versus Prince George's County a few years back. You remember giving a deposition in a case called Curtis?
Yes.
And you've been involved in any number of depositions over your career as a forensic pathologist, haven't you, sir?
Yes, sir.
But in every one of them, you took an oath that you would tell the truth at the depositions, right?
Yes.
So with that said, let's look at your question and answer from this deposition. Question: what would it take a police officer to do in that situation to cause compressional or positional asphyxia? Well, the compressional specifically would require the weight of several officers on the actual torso and abdominal area, something that is documented in the medical literature as burking, which is a method of killing people that was made popular back in England in the Middle Ages when they were looking for bodies to teach medical students anatomy. Did I read that accurately?
Yes.
Can we agree that when you gave the answer to this question, you did not say anything about in excess of 200 pounds or 220 pounds? Is that true?
All I said would take the weight of several officers on the torso and abdominal area. That's exactly what I said there.
Sir, I just asked you if you made any reference to having a weight that exceeds either 200 or 220 pounds. Did you make any such reference, yes or no?
I didn't give a specific weight, I just said several officers.
So we know here, in this case, when Mr. Chauvin was on Mr. Floyd's back and neck, from time to time he was pressing down forcefully with his knee also on the left arm. You saw the knee on the left arm from time to time, didn't you, sir?
Yes, I did.
I want to ask you in that framework about another quote from Spitz and Fisher, Exhibit 814 for identification purposes on page 833. I'm sorry, 833. Contrary to the belief of some, it is our opinion that pinning down the shoulders or forcefully pressing down the arms is equivalent to loading the back. A struggling, agitated individual breathes faster, has a faster heartbeat, elevated blood pressure, and heightened metabolism. Such an individual requires more air and more oxygen. Immobilization of the chest, even if only partially reducing the ability to maintain vital functions, culminates in cardiac arrhythmia. Do you agree with the statement from Spitz and Fisher? Sure.
No, specifically, I do not. They stated it is their opinion, and again, this is a medical opinion expressed by those particular authors. It's not a scientific fact.
Thank you, Brent. Dr. Fowler, do you agree that with Mr. Floyd in a prone, stomach down position, with Mr. Chauvin applying some pressure to the neck and pressure to the torso in a downward position, that these forces would be symbiotic? They would actually add together. Is that true?
Yes. I agree. In the paper by Kroll, as I quoted earlier on, the single knee,
Dr. Fowler, I just asked if it was true.
yes, Dr. Kroll confirmed that.
And all those things together would make somebody more likely than if those factors weren't present. It would make it more likely for them to succumb to asphyxia, correct?
If the weight is sufficient, yes.
You told us, Dr. Fowler, that you had been able to catch some of the testimony at the trial from some of the other medical persons who testified. You didn't see all of it, but you've seen some of it.
That is correct, sir, yes.
Are you then aware that a number of medical experts and others have testified that Mr. Floyd died primarily to the effects of low oxygen that arose out of Mr. Chauvin's subdual restraint and neck compression? Are you aware that a number of persons have testified about that?
Yes, I am.
I'd like to talk with you about what specifically you have done to actually assess what Mr. Floyd's actual oxygen reserves would have been during the subdual, restraint, and compression on May 25th of 2020 while he was underneath the body of Mr. Chauvin. You wrote a report containing your opinions in this case, and it is dated on February 22nd of 2021, right?
Yes.
I will represent to you and assume for purposes of my questions that in expiratory lung volumes, or EELV, is the amount of air that remains in your chest between breaths. Will you accept that as a premise for my question?
The end respiratory lung volume?
Yes,
Is that
sir.
what you're referring to?
The EELV, yes.
Yes.
And I'll refer to that commonly as simply the body's oxygen reserves, just as a common way to refer to it. And
It's the air that's left in your lungs. It's not a body's oxygen reserve. Your major oxygen reserve is in the oxygen dissolved in your bloodstream.
we'll just call it the EELV then, okay?
Thank you.
All right. Do you agree that as the EELV decreases, that it takes more work to breathe?
I believe so, yes.
Incidentally, you were having a discussion, had a discussion with Mr. Nelson about the hypopharynx. You recall that discussion?
Yes.
Now, the report that you prepared in this case was 31 pages or thereabouts. Fair enough?
Yes.
Can we agree that the word hypopharynx doesn't appear in your report in any of the 31 pages expressing your opinions, does it?
That is correct.
Now, you had made some comments earlier that you couldn't find anything in the literature about whether the hypopharynx may be impeded by restraints on the back. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
And I take it you went to look at forensic pathology studies in that regard, didn't you?
I searched the general literature and forensic pathology sources, yes.
Did you look actually in physiology journals, sir?
That I would consider to be part of the general medical literature.
So yes, you did look in physiology journals.
I searched broadly for it. I don't know whether it's... I did not specifically focus on look in physiology journals only.
Well, I don't want to confuse the jury now. Do you...
No.
Do you... I'm sorry, Judge.
Sidebar, please. I'm sorry, you can restate the question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Fowler, I was simply trying to get a clear answer, if you can give us one. Do you have a specific recollection of actually looking at physiology journals on the question of the relationship between the hypopharynx and the ability to breathe?
I specifically did a PubMed search, which includes human physiology journals, and nothing came up on my search. So therefore I did not read any physiology journals on this because nothing came up in the search.
So, Dr. Fowler, did you calculate quantitatively and include in your report what Mr. Floyd's EELV was while he was sitting on the sidewalk before the subdual and restraint began on the ground?
No, I don't believe I did.
Did you calculate and record the amount of air he took in with each breath at any point in time, either before or during the subdual and restraint on the ground?
No.
Did you do any quantitative assessment in your report for the time while he was sitting on the sidewalk by the Dragon Walk, of whether his breathing, his EELV was either normal or whether it was abnormal?
No, I did not.
Incidentally, if his EELV was 89, that is 89 millimeters of mercury, would you agree that that would have been normal then, before the time of his subdual and restraint on the ground?
I typically do not do pulmonary medicine, so the exact ranges of human beings are not something that I classically keep in my head, so I don't know that number, Counselor.
When Mr. Floyd then was laid prone on the street, when he's face down, did you do any calculations of what any reduction may have been in his EELV due to him being placed in a prone position?
No.
When Mr. Chauvin had his knees on Mr. Floyd's back, left arm and left side, did you do any calculations quantitatively for how that weight on the back would have had any impact on his EELV?
No, I did not.
Would you agree with me then that as the EELV goes down, do you agree that as that goes down, it takes more work to breathe?
That is my understanding, but I'm not a pulmonary physician.
All right, so fair enough. For that, you would defer to a pulmonary physician.
For more detail, yes.
Well, let me ask you this, and you will tell me if I'm asking the wrong person, Dr. Fowler. Would you agree that pressure on the soft side of the neck also narrows the size of the upper airway, the hypopharynx?
I have not seen any literature which indicates that that happens. That was one of the specific things I searched for. Because you're correct, Councillor, it was not something that was put into the report, because it's not something that I have ever heard of. And so I then went and looked for pressure on the neck causing restriction of the hypopharynx, and my literature search was not fruitful.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. If we might show Exhibit 941 that's already in evidence. So showing you, Dr. Fowler, what has been entered in the evidence as Exhibit 941. If we look at the left picture, we can see here, and I'll represent to you this Mr. Chauvin, who's on top of Mr. Floyd. You can see here Mr. Chauvin's knee on the back part of the neck in the left photograph. Can you see that, sir?
Yes.
And then on the right picture, you can see that his knee is on the side of the neck, on the soft side. Can you see that also?
Yes, on the back of the right side of the neck.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Brett. And I think you referred to Mr. Floyd's death as a sudden death event. Is that the word you used?
Yes, more sudden than prolonged.
If we focus on the first 5 minutes that Mr. Floyd is restrained on the ground, you were able to see in that 5 minutes, first saw Mr. Floyd just struggling to breathe, right? Well, I'll rephrase it, Jan. You could see in the first 5 minutes, or hear that Mr. Floyd was first calling out that he can't breathe.
Correct. Mr. Floyd verbalized, "I can't breathe," multiple times.
And you then later heard him actually call out for his mother.
Yes.
And as time passed in that first 5 minutes, you could hear that his voice got thicker and quieter. You could hear that, couldn't you?
I did not perceive that, but I'm no better at listening than anybody else is, so anybody can make up their own opinion with regard to that.
But to your hearing, you didn't hear any change in Mr. Floyd's voice. Is that what you're saying, sir?
Not that I noticed.
Did you notice that during the 5 minutes that his words got further apart?
Yes, they did.
Did you notice that after roughly 4 minutes and 45 seconds that Mr. Floyd went unconscious?
Yes.
Then did you notice that sometime after 5 minutes, he was found not to have had a pulse?
Correct.
In your report, you refer to this as a sudden death event, but in your report and your findings, you don't record a time, do you, sir, for when the sudden death supposedly occurred, do you?
I don't specifically remember doing that. Correct.
So if we look at this continuum from hearing George Floyd calling out that he can't breathe to the point that he doesn't have a pulse, over that 5 minute time period, is it fair to say that that is what you're referring to as a sudden death?
No.
All right. Then, all right, I asked you the question about when the sudden death occurred. Where in this spectrum, then, it's okay if you don't know the specific time, but where in this continuum did the sudden death occur from the time he is on the ground saying he can't breathe to the point in time he's found not to have a pulse? Are you able to generally characterize where the sudden death took place?
So what you're referring to as a sudden death, and I may well have misinterpreted, I'm referring to as a sudden cardiac arrest. There's a difference between death and cardiac arrest. Cardiac arrest is not absolutely irreversible and not synonymous with a person always passing away. So there's going to be a period of time between his cardiac arrest. For instance, in this particular case, the official pronouncement was done in the hospital. Frankly, he was dead long before that. But the moment of death is not something that you can easily document.
So when we are in this space where there is a space between cardiac arrest and between the actual death, are you suggesting that though Mr. Floyd may have been in cardiac arrest, there was a time when he may have been revived because he wasn't dead yet?
Immediate medical attention for a person who's gone into cardiac arrest may well reverse that process, yes.
Do you feel that Mr. Floyd should have been given immediate emergency attention to try to reverse the cardiac arrest?
As a physician, I would agree.
Are you critical of the fact that he wasn't given immediate emergency care when he went into cardiac arrest?
Yeah, as a physician, I would agree.
When you were observing the footage of Mr. Floyd after he's gone unconscious, there's a point in time where you see his legs raise up. Do you recall seeing his legs raised at the point after he was unconscious on the ground?
Yes.
Was that leg raising, was that consistent with what's known as an anoxic seizure?
That is what we would typically call it, yes.
And an anoxic seizure typically represents that there has been some damage to the brainstem due to insufficient oxygen. True?
It's anoxic, or in some cases we would call it hypoxic seizure, and it's not damage to the brainstem. It means that the part of the brain that governs our actual muscular movement, which is the higher portion of the brain, is not functioning properly. So typically people with seizure disorders who have seizure activity, it's from the motor cortex and not from down at the brainstem. If you've damaged the brainstem at that particular stage, the person is effectively going to be deceased.
So, but it's fair to say when we see an anoxic seizure, at the very least, we know that the brain is suffering from insufficient oxygen.
Yes.
Do you agree that low oxygen in the body, insufficient oxygen, it can cause brain injury, can't it?
Absolutely.
And it can also result in PEA, pulseless electrical activity, true?
True.
Now, Mr. Floyd had a PEA, a pulseless electrical activity arrhythmia, when his body was taken away from the scene on May 25th, 2020, didn't he?
Correct.
Is it true, Dr. Fowler, that the most common cause of a PEA is low oxygen, insufficient oxygen?
To the brain?
Yes, sir.
Yes, which can also be caused by a cardiac standstill. So no oxygen to the brain from either mechanism will cause PEA.
I had a number of questions. I'm kind of thinking through them. I'll just ask you this. I had a number of questions that have to do with whether you did any sort of quantitative measurements about Mr. Floyd's oxygen levels, his EELV at different points in time, including at what point in time do you think his oxygen stores were completely depleted? I take it, Dr. Fowler, if I have any questions about quantitative measurements about Mr. Floyd's EELV, those would not have been measurements that you would have undertaken for any reason, right?
Correct.
And to the extent we are looking for such measurements, better to ask either a pulmonologist, a respiratory physiologist, but not necessarily, well, not Dr. Fowler as a forensic pathologist. Fair enough?
Fair enough. Forensic pathologists do not typically look at living people who are breathing.
By the same token, if I had a series of questions about measurements of the carbon dioxide levels in Mr. Floyd's body after he ceased to breathe, between the time that he ceased to breathe and before the time he was given oxygen, when he was picked up and given medical care and taken to Hennepin County Medical Center. You didn't do any quantitative analysis, did you, as to the carbon dioxide levels in Mr. Floyd's body in between the time he ceased to breathe and then the time he would receive assisted oxygen?
No, not specific quantitative analysis, no.
Now, you had quite a discussion about the paraganglioma. Remember that discussion?
Yes.
Do you know we had a witness who testified who refers to it as an incidentaloma? You ever heard that expression before?
Yes.
Now, you talked about the paraganglioma potentially being an issue if it were secreting adrenaline, right?
Correct.
90% of paragangliomas do not secrete adrenaline. Is that right? Is that right?
I think that's probably correct. I don't have that number in my head, but I have no reason to disbelieve that.
Now, you're not telling the jury, are you, sir, that Mr. Floyd died from a paraganglioma, are you?
No.
And although Dr. Baker did identify the paraganglioma on autopsy, he didn't perform any test to determine whether it was a secreting tumor, that is, secreting adrenaline, did he?
Correct. The only way to test those particular tumors is there's two methods to test. One is to do a blood test, and if the paraganglioma is one which is constantly secreting, you'll pick it up on a blood test. For those paragangliomas that tend to be cyclical, if you do a blood test and you happen to pick it up at the bottom of a cycle, it won't show. And so in some cases, the first test is to do a blood test. If it's positive, you've got your answer. If that blood test is negative, you then go on to do a 24-hour urine catecholamine screen, which will pick up the surges and the dips, and that is then the second test that would be done in these cases. Neither of them were done.
Doctor, just for clarification, is it pronounced paraganglioma or paraganglionoma?
I often add in the extra vowel, so it's a paraganglioma. Paraganglioma, sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Fowler. Now, is it true that in all the world literature, there have only been 6 reported cases of people who have died from a sudden heart event from adrenaline release from a paraganglioma? Is that true?
That's what the literature says, because in many cases it may go completely unrecognized.
I just asked if it was true, Dr.
Yes, that's
Fowler.
what's in the literature.
Now, one of the signature hallmarks for a paraganglioma is a headache, right?
If it is one that does secretion at surge and then dip and surge. So if it's one that constantly secretes a small amount, it will not cause any symptoms at all.
Right. But to the extent, we know that amongst the various complaints that Mr. Floyd had about pains, he never did complain about a headache, did he?
I seem to remember one admission where he complained of a headache, but I'm going from memory now, and I am not sure.
And here I'm referring to on May 25th of last year. You have a recollection that Mr. Floyd complained of a headache?
I know he complained of tooth pain and a few other things, but I can't be sure that he did not complain of a headache. I do not have a clear recollection, Councillor.
Right. I won't hold you to that then.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Fowler, you asked some questions about Mr. Floyd saying, "I can't breathe," before he was put on the ground during the subdual and the restraint. Do you recall that discussion?
Yes.
Were you able to see what was happening with Mr. Floyd as they were trying to get him into what's referred to as Squad 320?
Yes.
Were you aware of whether or not Mr. Floyd was experiencing being choked as he was being put into the back of Squad 320?
I did not see a limb around his neck from my recollection. That's not something that I noticed.
Your Honor and Counsel, I have a couple of stills from Exhibit 43 that's already in. And these are numbered Exhibits 281 and 282. and I would offer those stills from Exhibit 43 already in evidence.
Any objections?
281, 282, Counsel?
Yes, sir. May I, Your Honor? Just
Yeah.
No.
281 and 282 are received.
thank you, Your Honor. So we could first, Brad, if we could show 282. Can you see here in 282, this area? Do you see where I've circled, Dr. Fowler?
Yes.
And do you see this arm that is around Mr. Floyd's neck?
Yes.
Do you recognize this person to be Mr. Chauvin?
It appears to be yes.
And if I could show you 281. I'm sorry, Your Honor, if you could. And here we see the top of Mr. Floyd's face. And then there's a hand here on his neck. Do you see that?
Yes.
And so you, these weren't images or scenes that you had paid special attention to before as you looked at what was going on in Squad 320? You had not seen any arms or anything around Mr. Floyd's neck?
Now, I'd seen these particular sections. I'm sorry if I misinterpreted your question. You said before he went into Squad 320. I apologize if I misinterpreted your question.
And so do you know whether when Mr. Floyd was into the back of Squad 320 and before he's pulled out, whether he complained about being choked? Did he say, "I'm getting choked"?
I believe he did, yes.
And it doesn't take a medical doctor such as yourself to know that if somebody feeling that they are getting choked, well, that would be a good reason why they would say they can't breathe.
Yes.
I wanted Dr. Fowler to see if you could just clear up a couple of things for me just in the timeline of what happened with respect to Mr. Floyd and restraint on the ground. Was the leg extension, the anoxic seizure as we've referred to it, was that before he lost consciousness or was it after he had lost consciousness?
After.
Okay. And did you make a note of when Mr. Floyd's, when was his last vocal sound? Do you remember?
Somewhere between a minute, 45 seconds and a minute before, I've got the information written down somewhere, before he went unconscious was about the last time that he actually vocalized.
If we focus in on the period of the subdual restraint and the neck compression, was there ever a time when, during the 9 minutes and 29 seconds, where you saw Mr. Floyd either sleepy, unarousable, or anything that's akin to being in a coma?
So from the period after he has those hypoxic seizures?
Or from the time he's first put on the ground, that he's pulled out of the car, Squad 320, he's subdued and restrained on the ground, Mr. Chauvin is on his neck and back. Did you ever see Mr. Floyd at any time manifest either sleepiness, a lack of awareness, that he wasn't arousable, or that sort of thing?
No, not until he lost consciousness.
And typically, doctor, when somebody passes away from a fentanyl or opioid overdose, one of the hallmarks of that is that they are very sleepy, and they will tend to be unarousable and pass away in essentially a coma, right?
Correct. If they are passing away from fentanyl overdose, that's what happens.
And Mr. Floyd was manifesting none of those outward symptoms, was he, on the ground?
Correct. It does not exclude the fact that it was still having a depressive effect on his respiratory system.
Well, before he lost consciousness, his respiration rate, I think you told us that you agree with Dr. Tobin, was somewhere in the ballpark of 22 breaths a minute, right?
Correct.
That is normal, isn't it?
Yes.
If fentanyl was affecting his respiration, then you would expect a respiratory rate that would have been appreciably less than 22 breaths a minute if it's depressing his respiratory system, right?
Unless he should have been breathing at 30 at that particular stage because of his exertion and other stressors.
And you have no really basis or baseline to suggest that Mr. Floyd should have been breathing at 30 instead of the normal 22, right?
A person who is getting short of oxygen to their brain will often increase or usually increase their respiratory rate to more than 30.
I want to talk with you a bit about the methamphetamine. First, let me clear up, if I can, this issue of pills again in the car on May 25th. When Dr. Baker performed the autopsy, isn't it true that there weren't any pills found in Mr. Floyd's stomach?
Correct. Dr. Baker did not identify any pill, tablet, call you what you want, residue within the stomach.
And obviously any pill that's found in a car is a pill that's not in Mr. Floyd's body.
Correct. Whatever the residual amount in those tablets was not in his body.
Now, I think you made a statement with respect to the methamphetamine that it was not accompanied by a metabolite commonly seen if the meth had been in the system for an appreciable period of time.
Yes.
And I want to kind of be clear on this. Have you, since making the statement in your report, learned that in fact the metabolite of methamphetamine, that is amphetamine as the metabolite, was present in Mr. Floyd's bloodstream from the toxicology results?
I have heard a statement to that fact, yes.
Did you investigate the statement to determine whether or not it was true?
Yes.
And did you find that contrary to what you had written in your report, you in fact found that the metabolite of methamphetamine was present from the toxicology results for Mr. Floyd?
In very low levels, so it did not change my opinion.
Well, the methamphetamine itself was only present in very low levels. Isn't that true?
That is true.
And so if there's not a lot of meth, then there won't be a lot of the metabolite either. That makes sense, doesn't it?
Correct. And or again, substantial amount of whatever methamphetamine is there has not yet been metabolized.
So what was the level of methamphetamine that was found in his toxicology results? Do you remember?
Not offhand, no.
How about 19 nanograms per milliliter? Does that sound right?
It sounded right. I did not want to say it because I did not want to be inaccurate.
Yeah. Thank you, doctor. 19 nanograms of methamphetamine is within the range of what you would see in a patient whose doctor prescribed a therapeutic dose of methamphetamine. True?
That is true if methamphetamine is used in a therapeutic environment.
Your Honor, could I have just 1 second? So last question, Dr. Fowler, then I will sit down for now. I wanted to, again, just address the timeline from your report. And I will read it to you, and my question would be whether or not this is the timeline that you stand behind, if I may. So at 8:24:09, the last audible vocal sounds identifiable as Mr. Floyd's are heard. Soon thereafter, voices from bystanders tell police he is not breathing. Mr. Floyd exhibits extension movements of right lower extremity at 8:24:21 and movements of his right arm at 8:24:33. At 8:25:16, Mr. Floyd appears to have passed out. So, representation from your report, is that your best knowledge and information, sir?
That's the information I extracted at that time. Yes.
And you stand by that too at this time, correct?
I have no reason to disagree with that at this time now.
Yeah. Dr. Fowler, thank you.
Nelson, should we break it this time, or can you be brief? Break?
Yeah.
All right. Break. We'll take our 20-minute break. Let's try and think about 10 after. Doctor's still under oath.
Yes, I'm on that.
Good afternoon, sir. A few follow-up questions, Dr. Fowler. First of all, you were asked a series of questions about the weight of Mr. Chauvin, correct?
Yes,
And how you obtained that information,
correct.
and whether you took into consideration the weight of Mr. Chauvin's equipment and body-worn armor and things of that nature.
Correct.
To your knowledge, have you ever been provided with any actual weights of what a duty belt, its accoutrements, its the body armor actually weighs?
No.
Have you ever, to your knowledge, in the materials that you received, did the state of Minnesota ever conduct any such weighing experiments?
None that I saw.
And you were asked those questions relevant, would you agree, relevant to the analysis of positional asphyxia, correct?
That is my understanding, yes.
Now, you would also were asked a series of questions about the bruising, things of that nature that you would see or anticipate seeing in these types of cases, right?
Yes.
Would the amount of weight that a person have, in your opinion, increase or decrease the likelihood of seeing such abrasions, whether it be below the skin or in the muscles?
The more energy that is applied to that particular part of the body, the more likelihood there's going to be an injury. And the heavier the person, the more likelihood there's going to be more energy. So yes, heavier people are more likely to cause injury to an individual.
And in your practice, whether it be as the pathologist, or excuse me, the chief pathologist in Maryland, or through the forensics panel, or any of your other private endeavors, have you ever reviewed cases of positional asphyxia?
Yes, numerous.
And have you seen those types of injuries in other cases?
Objection, Your Honor, is asked and answered in human time.
Overruled.
Yes, I have.
And do you, in those cases, did you have the luxury of comparing it to body-worn cameras and things of that nature?
No. I mean, body-worn cameras are a relatively new source of information for us. For many years, we were restricted to statements.
You were asked a series of questions about what type of testing you performed relevant to the CO2. Do you recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay. You testified that your report was submitted on February 22nd of this year, correct?
Correct.
Did your report that you prepared include your assessment involving the potential for CO2 or carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide in Mr. Floyd?
Yes, it did.
Since February 22nd, have you been provided with any tests, experiments, any information that the state of Minnesota did similar types of testing?
No, I have not been provided with any such information.
But since that time, were you provided with photographs of the bottom of the squad car 320?
Yes, I was.
Has that been since this trial has started?
Yes, it's been within the last couple of days, to the best of my recollection.
You were shown a couple of photographs of Mr. Floyd and a brief blurb, a video blurb while he was in the Cup Foods store and asked to see if there was something in his mouth.
Yes.
And can you say that what that was with any specificity in his mouth at that time?
No.
Can you say that what was in his mouth in Cup Foods was the same object you saw in his mouth in his vehicle when Officer Lane approached him?
No.
Would you agree that at the drugs that were found in Squad Car 320, to your knowledge, contained Mr. Floyd's DNA?
Objection, lady.
Sustained, rephrase.
What do you know about the drugs that were found in the back of Squad 320?
There were white, what looked like tablet remnants, and they were tested for Mr. Floyd's DNA, and I believe they were also tested for his saliva, and they were positive for both.
And those were methamphetamine and or fentanyl?
Yes.
Do you recall, again, whether Mr. Floyd was handcuffed while in the squad car?
Yes, I did not see him have his handcuffs removed at any time until such time as resuscitation started, and that's the period all the way from when the handcuffs were first applied to him outside his own vehicle.
Immediately in the sort of the door frame of the vehicle?
Yes.
And prior to that point, at any point did you see any videotapes of Mr. Floyd going into Squad 320 prior to the police being present?
No. No.
Now, you were asked a series of questions about an affidavit that was prepared by Mr. Ray, or Dr. Ray, I should say, back in 2005. Were you familiar with the intricacies of this particular litigation?
No, I'd never seen that affidavit before, and I have no idea what the litigation was about.
Do you have any idea as to the context of this document?
No.
Now, you were asked about a couple of paragraphs where he apparently does not retract his position on positional asphyxia.
Correct.
And you skipped over, or you were asked to skip over a couple of other paragraphs as well, correct?
Yes.
Would it refresh your recollection to review the affidavit and put his statements within the proper context as you view them?
Yes.
My approach?
Thank you.
Does that refresh your recollection?
Yes.
What was the context of those statements?
Well, the context is not specifically stated as to why he was making this statement.
Okay. Were there other statements that he made that you found important?
Yes.
What were those?
There was one here which says, a 280-pound man with a large abdominal panniculus, i.e. protuberant belly, is at risk in the face-down position, as well as a person with obstructive pulmonary disease. And there are many shades in between. And so Dr. Donald Ray never retracted his opinion as to obese individuals, but he did at one time or another state that the average person who is muscular and not compromised in any way would have no risk.
And that was in relation to the Chan studies out of San Francisco?
Right. And then if he then goes on to say, not enough is known to say whether or not a method of restraint is free from any potential lethal effects. So basically not enough, no.
There wasn't enough information.
Correct.
You were asked a series of questions about whether you're a pulmonologist or a toxicologist, etc., correct?
Correct.
You're a pathologist, correct?
That is my training and expertise, yes.
Do you treat living patients?
No.
How did the patients that you observe appear to you?
They are deceased.
Are people, you were asked a series of questions about your work with the forensic panel, whether it was a non-profit organization or whether it was some volunteer time. Do you recall those questions?
Yes, I do.
And it was, forensic panel is a business, correct?
Yes.
Fair to say. Would you change your opinion simply by virtue of the fact you are being paid?
No, not at all.
Are people who volunteer their time more trustworthy in your experience?
Objection, Your Honor, for Roland.
Sustained.
You were asked a series of questions about a 4-minute time period where applying pressure to the neck, maintaining it there for 4 minutes would cause irreversible brain damage. Remember those?
Yes, that was a very specific question.
Can you expound on that a little bit more? What types of variables might affect that?
Well, basically anything which stops blood getting to the brain for 4 minutes will cause irreversible brain damage. Not just a asphyxial process, but a process where the blood has stopped being pumped to the brain.
So if the heart stops circulating blood, stops processing oxygen to the brain, 4 minutes, irreversible brain damage.
Yes, well, for whatever reason the brain stops getting oxygen, after 4 minutes, the current medical literature considers that there is a high likelihood of irreversible damage to that brain.
Do you recall that question that counsel asked you, specifically relevant to the position of Mr. Floyd or Mr. Chauvin's knee?
Yes, he did.
Based upon your review of the video in this case, did you observe Mr. Chauvin's knee obstructing the carotid artery of Mr. Floyd?
That knee did not obstruct either carotid artery, and even if it had obstructed one, the carotid artery on the other side plus the 2 vertebral arteries would continue to supply the brain with enough blood for it to function.
You were also asked a series of questions on cross-examination about traumatic manifestations and the frequency with which you may expect them, correct?
Yes.
And I believe in this regard you were shown some language out of a Spitz and Fisher book.
Yes.
When was that Spitz and Fisher book published?
I did not see which edition it was.
Okay.
There have been 5 editions, so that I don't know. And the other thing there was the wording was different. It said often no signs of physical, not usually, which was my recollection of the question. And again, I apologize if I misheard the question. But,
so there are cases where you may have a positional asphyxia case that does not show these traumatic manifestations. Agreed?
yes, absolutely.
Would you agree likewise that there are cases of positional asphyxiation where you do see these traumatic manifestations?
Yes.
And in your experience with these types of cases, is it common to see bruising, petechia, things of that nature?
It is very common.
Now, you were asked a question about whether or not any of the studies on positional asphyxia and prone restraint ever reviewed a 9-minute and 29-second time period.
Yes, the laboratory studies.
Are you familiar with the cardiopulmonary effects of physical restraint in subjects with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease in the Journal of Clinical Forensic Medicine?
Yes, I think I have. I believe I read that article.
Would it refresh your recollection to just review it briefly?
Please.
May I approach?
Thank you. Yes, I believe that I have actually seen this particular paper on individuals with chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases.
Does it include
I am familiar with
positional,
it.
prone positioning greater than 9 minutes and 29 seconds?
Yes.
You were asked a couple of questions about a deposition testimony you gave in Curtis versus Prince County. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Fair to say that was one small portion of a larger deposition testimony?
Yes, and the reference to burking kind of cut off the second part of burking.
What is burking?
So it's a process where somebody would sit on somebody's chest to restrict chest movements. At the same time, somebody else would be applying another method of asphyxia to them, often suffocation.
And that was in order to basically get cadavers?
Yes, they were they were in the business of obtaining cadavers for medical study, and they wanted people that didn't have any significant injuries. This was a method by which these two individuals figured out they could kill people without leaving any marks on them and then sell the cadavers for medical study.
Gotcha. And I believe, and I don't have, unfortunately, the transcript accessible on the computer, but I believe you referenced multiple officers or something to that effect being on the actual torso, correct?
In that particular case, yes.
You were asked a series of questions. Let me ask you this real quick. You were asked a question about Dr. Baker's finding at autopsy relevant to the stomach contents.
Yes.
To your knowledge, were the stomach contents ever tested or analyzed for any toxicological substances?
I never saw any reporting on the stomach contents being analyzed in a laboratory for any substances that may be present.
And if Dr. Baker testified that his office maintains those samples for other doctors, other people to review, have you been made aware of any tests that were conducted subsequent to Dr. Baker's autopsy on the stomach contents of Mr. Floyd?
I am not aware of any studies that were done on that material.
You were asked again a series of questions about EELV, and there was a question about the oxygen reserves. Do you recall generally?
Yes.
In terms of the oxygen reserves, where in your, based on your experience, is the main oxygen reserve stored?
The main oxygen reserve, in my opinion, is within the blood. It's the dissolved oxygen that's already attached to the hemoglobin. And that will continue to circulate around the body for a period of time. What is in the lungs is part of the exchange process. I would not call that an oxygen reserve.
Now, in terms of this particular case and the measurements of EELV, were you aware of any pulmonologists or respiratory therapists measuring Mr. Floyd's EELV during the course of this incident?
No. There is no evidence that that happened, and obviously it's not on the video, so it did not happen.
And so any measurement would be theoretical?
Yes.
You were asked a question about Mr. Floyd saying that he couldn't breathe, right? Do you recall those questions?
Yes.
And making those statements in the context of being in the prone position, correct?
Correct.
Based on your review, do you recall hearing Mr. Floyd make similar statements prior to being placed in the prone restraint position?
Yes, that's my recollection.
You were asked a question about the anoxic seizure that you observed in the video.
Yes.
And that's recognizable as an anoxic seizure to you, a physician, right?
Yes.
And a seizure generally involves a pretty significant amount of motion or movement.
Objection leading, Your Honor.
Rephrase, sustained.
How would you describe in this particular case what you observed in terms of the anoxic seizure?
A small amount of twitching and or extension of a body part, which is very classical of hypoxic seizures, often commonly described in situations where people have a sudden cardiac event, as well as any other. It's just a situation of the brain not getting enough oxygen, and very different from the grand mal type seizure that you would see in an epileptic, which are much, much more vigorous.
And recognizable to you as a physician or other physicians with comparable experience?
Yes.
To your knowledge, is Mr. Chauvin a physician of 27 years?
No.
You were asked a question about PEA, pulseless electrical activity, right?
Yes.
Can a PEA arrhythmia occur from a cardiac origin?
Yes.
You were asked a second series of questions about EELV measurements in terms of, and again, I understand you're not a pulmonologist, right? Are people variable?
Every one of us as a human being is completely individual and different from the person standing next to us, yes.
You were asked a series of questions about the paraganglioma
Yes.
and whether you recalled Mr. Floyd ever saying or complaining of a headache.
I recall that question, yes.
Do you recall Mr. Floyd saying that everything hurts?
Yes.
Do you recall him at any time saying his head hurts?
I have a recollection of it, but I cannot put my finger on it. It's just in my memory.
Paraganglioma, if gone unrecognized, can that cause hypertension?
Yes. Specifically if it's one of the forms that does secrete adrenaline.
Continuously or
Both.
both? So you were asked a series of questions about you would agree your agreement that it's important not to mislead the jury, right?
Correct.
And you were shown a couple of still photographs of time from a body-worn camera where it appeared that Mr. Chauvin had his arm around the neck of Mr. Floyd.
In that area, yes.
Based upon your recollection, do you know if that was a moment in time during which Mr. Floyd made those comments?
I don't have an association of that hold with him making a statement, and I recall it being fairly brief, a brief period that the arm was around the neck.
I'd like to show you about a 1-minute portion of Exhibit 43, which is already in evidence. When they publish. Okay. It's a Tao's body camera at 2018-00. switch it over to you. Towel. $2018.00. That's fine.
Please! Please, mate! Please! No, I can't choke! I can't breathe, Bobby! Please!
Do you hear what Mr. Floyd is saying in that second?
Yes.
Do you see where he's located in the squad car?
He's closest to the sidewalk at that particular stage, yes. On the driver's side of the vehicle.
Do you observe Mr. Chauvin at that point?
No.
You can play again.
No, I can't choke! I can't breathe, Bobby! Please! You're talking.
I'm sorry, if you can just keep
Sit down. Fine. My wrist, man. My wrist, man, please. Okay, let me lay on the ground. I'm gonna lay on the ground. I'm gonna lay on the ground. I'm gonna lay on the ground. I'm going down. I'm going down. I'm going down. I'm not gonna run, man. Right. I know I can't breathe. I can't breathe.
You're talking and you can't breathe. Oxygen not so you can't breathe.
I just had COVID, man. I can't breathe. Okay.
Do you observe that in that instance?
Yes.
Did it appear to you that Mr. Chauvin had a tight, firm grip around Mr. Floyd's neck?
No, actually it looked very loose, and the hand was actually gripping the back of the neck in this sort of spinal column area, with a considerable gap in the front.
Thank you, Doctor. I have no further questions.
Any further, Mr. Blackwell?
Yes, Your Honor.
Dr. Fowler, just for a point of clarification, you've been asked a couple of rounds of questions about the drugs found in Squad 320. To be clear, what we're talking about is one pill, right?
I cannot recall if it's one or two, but it was one of those two numbers, yes.
One partially dissolved pill, right?
I thought it was two, but I stand corrected, Counselor.
And in the back of Squad 320, you didn't see any footage of Mr. Floyd spitting a pill out, did you?
No, I did not.
Now, you asked questions about the measurements of the EELV, and I think you arrived at the conclusion with Mr. Nelson that there could have been theoretical measurements made. Did you make any theoretical measurements of the EELV as a part of your analysis in this case?
No, I did not.
I want to ask you about, again, the 9 minutes and 29 seconds. The last 9 minutes and 29 seconds of Mr. Floyd's life during the subdual and the restraint. To be sure I understand your testimony. So if we focus just on the period of time when Mr. Floyd is on the ground, the subdual, the restraint, and the neck compression, can you tell us whether it is your opinion as to whether or not Mr. Chauvin's actions played any role in the death of Mr. Floyd during the subdual, restraint, and compression on the ground?
Objection beyond the scope.
Sustained.
Can you tell us whether it's your view that Mr. Floyd's passing after the 9 minutes and 29 seconds was coincidental and unrelated to the subdual and restraint on the ground?
Objection beyond the scope.
Sustained.
No further questions for you.
All right. Thank you, Doctor. You are excused.
Thank you very much, Roland.
Counsel sidebar. Okay, members of the jury, just checking on how long the next witness would take. I think it is the best way to do this is to schedule that for tomorrow. So we're going to release you for today. We'll start up between 9:15 and 9:30 tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a good night. Don't talk to anyone. Do not have any, don't watch the news. Thank you.